So we've already talked about toasted malts, the Munichs and the Victories of the world. We talked about stewed malts, which was the crystals and caramels. Talked about base malts.
Talked about acid malts.
And we've got plenty more to go over, but today we're going into roasted malts, which is a really fun topic.
Mostly because it is still dark out.
Yeah. Speaking of roasted malts, if you didn't already catch on, the roasted malts are going to be your dark malts. They're the malts that you can use to get anything from a pop of red color to a little bit of a brownish hue and all the way to a really, really black beer.
These are probably going to have the whitest color range you're going to work with just because they are so dark. Generally, what we're going to try to focus on today is the sort of moderate to dark end of that. While some can fall below that sort of 100 Lovibond range, we are going to be starting off with our pale chocolates, which are going to fall somewhere in that 200 Lovibond range and go all the way up to our super intense Carafa 3s that are like 600, 650, somewhere in there.
There's a multitude of uses, like I've already mentioned, when it comes to these roasted malts. But in general, when you're doing this, you're getting some sort of intense color with a very small amount of malt, and you're getting a little bit of that burnt-ish kind of flavor. So before we get too much into the mashing techniques and flavors and differences of these malts and technically how they're made, let's talk about the range of colors and flavors you can get with those. Starting on the lighter end, the pale chocolates.
Pale chocolates are honestly one of my favorite roasted malts. While they're going to have less of a color impact, they tend to be very, very smooth. These you can actually use in pretty high percentages. I'm not afraid to throw a pound or sometimes even more at a 5-gallon batch of beer for pale chocolate if you're doing something like a porter or a stout. But I also love using this in a very small amount. And a lot of other styles, a lot of sort of red styles when it comes to, American amber ales, for instance. I'll actually just throw in maybe 2 or 3 ounces just to give a touch of that drying character and also darken the beer a little bit.
Going a little bit darker from the pale chocolates is going to be the standard chocolates. This is also going to be where something like Carafa 1 falls into. And the light end, a lot of Americanized roasted barleys will fall into this 300 Lovibond range.
These are going to be your standard go-to malts for really a wide range of styles. Any dark beer, more than likely you're going to see some chocolate malts in there. The reasoning behind that is that they do produce a really well-rounded flavor profile that back up any dark beer.
Yeah, and it's still not burnt enough that all you're getting is burnt flavor in this, so there is a range of flavors that you'll be getting in this range. Chocolate malt specifically gives you kind of a powdery cocoa kind of feel to it, and as we found out in our chocolate malt video, wherever that is, not all chocolate malts are created equal.
Now let's jump over to the next sort of dark end of our spectrum here, which is spilling tea all over ourselves, and roasted barley. The American roasted barley from Reese, yeah, is going to fall right around that 300 Lovibond. I believe we use Baird's here, which is about 450.
I think it's a little bit darker than that, but yeah, it's somewhere in that 475 to 525 range. So big difference in roasted barleys, by the way.
Yep, and these are what we like to call the sort of smoky, meaty characteristic that you get, because you do get starting to get some of those tannins, some of that astringency off of the malts when you start getting in that range of color.
These are your classic used to kick up an imperial stout, basically, especially something in the Russian imperial stout range where that extra bitterness is really appropriate. These are the kind of the range of malts that we like to use.
And onto black malt.
We'll talk more about the difference between black malt and roasted barley when we kind of get into the specifics of how they're made, but basically black malt is often used interchangeably with roasted barley, but it has a little bit less of that character and also doesn't produce as much head color as roasted barley will.
Finally, we're going to go to, I think, the darkest that we carry, which are going to actually be the Carafa 3s and I believe Black Prince, which are actually going to be pushing that over 500 Lovibond, pushing 600 Lovibond range.
Yeah, the Carafas that we carry are dehusked, which we'll again talk a little bit more about when we break down the specifics. But yeah, they come in at the very dark end of the range and are good when you want to use the very tiny amounts to get some blackness, but without a lot of flavor, or if you already have a ton of other roasted malts in your grain bill and you just want to not get as much astringency.
I like to use these as food coloring in really small amounts in my beer. Honestly, things like a Schwarzbier that you really don't want that astringency in, I might only use 4 or 5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch, and that's actually enough to basically turn it black. Let's go into sort of a couple ways that these guys are made, because it turns out there is more than one way to get a heavily roasted malt.
The biggest difference is going into the roaster with either green barley, which means it's still moisturized, fresh out of the germination tank, or going into the roasting part of the process with a malted malt.
So to kind of give a callback, the green barley, like Peter is talking about, is what they start out when they are going to make crystal malts. And the roaster is actually the same sort of vessel that you are going to make a crystal malt in.
Yeah, so that going in with green barley, basically what you're doing is you're making caramel malts, you're making sugary malts, and you're burning that sugar off.
Just keep it going, basically.
Yeah.
But the other way, like you said, using a malt as a start is actually more similar to our typical kiln malts. Both methods end up with a much darker malt because you are going to be roasting them for a much longer time.
And or at a higher temperature.
So now that you know that these can actually be made in a couple different ways, let's actually talk about how these two ways of getting there are actually going to give you slightly different flavors and slightly different qualities to the grains.
The biggest example that we get is the difference between black malt and roasted barley. They are very similar color range and very similar darkness. A lot of times they're used interchangeably, but the black malt is, as the name suggested, malted first before going into that burnt process, and the roasted barley is going in as green barley. Fun fact about that is that black malt is going to give you a white head, and roasted barley will give you a little bit more of a tannish hue.
As well as anything that is going to be malted beforehand is actually going to have somewhat less of a protein content in it, so you're not going to quite get as many of those bodybuilding dextrins. So if you want more color with, I guess, less flavor, a malt might actually be the way to go, whereas if you want something that's sort of been brought through that stewed process, you want a little more flavor in there, then you're going to actually have a non-malted roasted barley, for instance.
When it comes down to flavor specifically, what I've really found is that the malted ones are going to have a little bit less of an astringency to go along with the burnt, a little bit less of that that starting to get a little bit old coffee kind of flavor, whereas the barleys will have a little bit more of that. And sometimes that astringency from the roast is appropriate.
On top of using a debittered malt or a dehusked malt, you can also actually play around with the amount of astringency and the amount of bitterness that you get in a beer by changing the way you mash with these malts. I know that I have done late additions to my mash. Typically, I'll add these malts in just before I start to sparge. And or you can actually do cold steeps with these, which are pretty common in things like imperial stouts that you want to maintain smooth while having loads and loads of roasted malt in them.
Yeah, that cold steep basically just entails soaking the malt in cold water, like it suggests, the roasted malt specifically, and then just adding that water tea either into the mash or into the boil kettle directly.
That's going to reduce the amount of that kind of bite that you get in the beer,
while maintaining a nice roast flavor.
Let's wrap all this up with some important things to know about roasted malts and really how they're going to affect your beer, more specifically your mash.
So the number one thing you need to know is that they have zero diastatic power. That's part of why you're using them at a lower percentage, but that means that they don't have any enzymes to convert. And so if you're trying to use flaked barley and roasted barley to make a beer, it's not going to work unless you add enzymes otherwise.
Another thing that you have to be aware of when you're using especially higher quantities, anything more than really a half pound, I would say, in a 5-gallon batch, is that these are going to lower your mash pH. By nature, these are going to be very acidic malts, and they are going to in turn, acidify your mash.
Yeah, so if you're calculating mash pH, be sure to look out for that. And that's about all we have to say today.
Roasted malts are pretty basic. Don't overdo them. That's the biggest advice for today.
When playing around with recipes, start on the lower end and then build up. You might get less color or flavor than you want in your first batch of beer, but that's okay, because it's better to have less of these than more.
And honestly, most beers turn out darker anyway. All right, Viva la beer. You already finished.
Like and subscribe and comment and bells and touch our dangly. Nope.